Most people are here, maybe a few others are gonna trickle in, but I'll go ahead and get us started. So I'm Sam Herr with the North American Bike Share and Scooter Share Association, or NABSA. And as part of the coalition helping America rebuild and go electric or charge, the North American Bike Share and Scooter Share Association, People for Bikes, and New Urban Mobility Alliance have been working with Congressman Blumenauer to host this policy briefing that will explain the importance and benefits of micromobility and how to leverage the current moment in policy and funding to create better access to jobs and daily needs, expand the transit shed, reduce single occupancy vehicle trips to help attain climate goals, and build more equitable transportation networks throughout the country. While the bipartisan infrastructure law, Inflation Reduction Act, and other recent transfusions of transportation funding, with these recent transfusions of transportation funding, we're at an important juncture and unique opportunity to consider how micromobility can be integrated into project studies and incentives as we move forward. So really excited to see all of you joining us today for this policy briefing, and really excited for this panel. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to hand it over to Noah at People for Bikes, who's going to share a little bit more about the recommendations that we've been working on in the Microability Working Group in the Charge Coalition.
Thanks, Sam, and hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Firstly, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please add them to the Q&A, but also feel free to introduce yourself and where you're coming from, or organization or office you're representing in the chat. That would be awesome. And we'll have a pretty robust Q&A section at the end. I'll also add that I think many of you know votes are going on right now in the House, so Congressman Blumenauer will join us in a little bit. So we'll get started with our panelists and then hear from him later on. But like Sam mentioned, People for Bikes, NABSA, and NUMO coming together on micromobility because there is this unprecedented opportunity for funding, policy, project ideas, and we helped pull together principles for all of this policy around micromobility as part of the Charge Coalition. And I will add to the chat a link to some more information about those principles, but hopefully those resonate with you in whatever work you do affecting or growing or implementing micromobility projects and programs. So excited to share them with you all and hear from our really just stellar panel of experts around micromobility. So with that, Sam, back to you.
Awesome, thanks, Noah. So we can go to the next slide, and I want to introduce our wonderful and amazing panelists. As Noah said, the congressman will be joining us hopefully at the end here. And in the panel today, we are going to hear from broad perspectives in the next hour: academia, operators, policymakers, industry, and advocates. So we're going to hear from Harriet Tregoning, Director of New Urban Mobility Alliance, Caroline Sampanero, Vice President, Head of Transit Micromobility Policy at Lyft, and Dr. Jennifer Dill, Professor and Director of the Transportation Research and Education Center at Portland State University. And then, as Noah said, we will have time for Q&A at the end. So please use that Q&A feature that you have in Zoom, and we'll get to those questions. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Harriet Tregoning, Director of New Urban Mobility Alliance. Take it away, Caroline, and we could probably, or sorry, Harriet, and we can probably take down the slides as well.
Great, it's wonderful to see all of you here today, and I'm very excited for this webinar and this topic. You know, in all the time that I've been working in transportation, there's never been as big an opportunity as right now to really reimagine our infrastructure and create an integrated multimodal transportation system that better serves all people in the U.S. with access to jobs and people's daily needs. I know we're all excited about the various bills, IJA, ARPA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and all of them are contributing funding that states and localities have the discretion to use to build the infrastructure that really serves all of their residents. There's been a great focus among policymakers on Capitol Hill on electric cars, which are a wonderful thing, but that's only part of the equation to decarbonize our transportation system. We have to acknowledge that car ownership is expensive and unaffordable for many. And some don't have the ability or the desire to drive. Car ownerships differ across demographic groups. Black households are 4 times as likely to be carless as white households, for instance. And we have to acknowledge that over-reliance on automobiles are contributing to pollution, poor air quality, and a rising pedestrian and cyclist safety crisis that's the worst that it's been in a really long time. Even in a place as where dependence on cars is so prominent, I think people lose sight of the fact that still more than half of all the trips that Americans take are 3 miles or less. Right now, 3/4 of those trips are taken by car, but a lot of those trips could be easily taken walking or biking if we had protected infrastructure for those trips. 30% of all trips that are taken are less than 1 mile. Think about how easy it would be to take those trips with a bike or with a scooter. But even those trips, 60% of them are now taken by car. So since most trips are short and don't need to be taken by automobile, and that's even more true today since the commute share of our trips is dropping. During the pandemic and post-pandemic, there's a real opportunity for those trips to be replaced, those car trips to be replaced by walking, micromobility, and transit. Think about the ways in which operators in cities are already using micromobility to increase the transit shed. So instead of having to add a lot of new stops for a bus system or even massively more expensively new rail stops, imagine creating a network where micromobility can get you much more easily than you can walk to a transit station. And a lot of localities, a lot of MPOs, a lot of transit agencies are investigating ways to do that. Jobs have returned to pre-pandemic levels. I'm happy to recognize, but with almost 3.5 fewer million workers, that means there are about 10 million job openings right now, and only 6 million unemployed workers. So in a very vivid way, employers really have a stake in finding new ways to get to workers and enable workers to get to their jobs. So we think micromobility, along with that investment in safer roads with protected micromobility lanes and infrastructure, could really increase access to jobs very cost effectively. And employers could incentivize micromobility. Many cities and states are providing incentives. Denver is a great example. They're providing e-bike rebates for residents. And the uptake on that rebate has been kind of unbelievably high. They're also setting aside larger amounts of money if you income qualify. So they're skewing their funding toward those households that have the least ability to afford transportation. You're going to hear more from Dr. Dill, I think, at the end of our program, and she's got some great information about a tool that Portland State's developing that catalogs all the e-bike incentive programs in North America. So one of the things I just wanted to flag is that for folks on the Hill to think about, we incentivize employers now, right? We give tax incentives for parking, for example. We think that employers have demonstrated how powerful they are in determining whether people even have to travel into work and perhaps how they travel. So thinking about the role of employers, I think, will be another important aspect of any legislative approaches that might be crafted. How can we incentivize employers to be part of the solution in terms of providing lots of ways for people to access jobs in the economy? I think I'll pause there and turn it over to my colleagues to continue our presentation and conversation.
Thanks, Harriet. Great opening words. Really love that you pointed out about 1/2 of trips that people are taking are 3 miles or less, and 30% of trips less than 1 mile. So I think that's really powerful, as well as weaving that into employer incentives to really then employers need to that have a stake in finding ways to get people to jobs. So thank you so much for those points. And now I'm going to turn it over to Caroline Bernardo, who's Vice President, Head of Transit and Microability Policy at Lyft. Over to you, Caroline.
Thanks, Sam. Hey, everyone. Great to be here today. As Sam mentioned, I oversee policy at Lyft for our bike share and scooter business. I'm also proud to say I'm the president of the NAPSA board this year. So I'm happy to be here sort of representing not just Lyft, but the industry and some of our thoughts on this. Lyft is most known for rideshare, but we are also the largest bike share provider in North America, which is pretty cool. And it's why I joined the company a little over 4 years ago. I was going to bring a brief sort of perspective from the operator in these opening remarks. For context, we operate the largest bike share systems in the US in 5 of like the largest cities. New York City by far and away being the largest, but for reference also operate Capital Bike Share in the DC region. We see the station-based approach is really critical to success over time, and it's super pertinent to the conversation around charging because of the opportunity for charging stations to enhance shared micromobility. For context, I think we all know this, but we really watched micromobility rise to the occasion during COVID, providing resiliency to the transit network and inviting many more Americans to try 2 wheels for the first time. We saw exponential growth. So right now we have systems in nearly 300 cities across 48 states, more than 230,000 vehicles in operations. That's not just Lyft, that's the industry overall. And on those shared bikes and scooters, more than 128 million trips were taken on shared micromobility in 2021. So as we're thinking about strengthening transit, decarbonizing transportation, shared micromobility has really, I think, proven it has a lot to offer here. We're also building a network that I think can be seamless with transit over time. Our systems across the country, by far and away, the most popular station locations are at transit hubs. For example, Grand Central in New York City, South Station in Boston, Union Station in both Denver and DC. So as we think about locating charging for multiple use cases, shared micromobility is a huge opportunity. Doubling down on e-bikes, I think e-bikes have really been a transformational addition to shared micromobility. Not only were they the #1 most sold electric vehicle last year, they've also really invited many new people to try bike share, which is super cool. Overall, we have the largest shared e-bike fleet in the US. And last year, 13.6 million trips were taken on our e-bikes. That was across 28 million miles, which is pretty cool. And e-bikes emit, 11.5 plus times less carbon than cars. So as we think about making non-driving more appealing, I think e-bikes can go a long way to doing that. It's also worth pointing out that I think we're seeing some trends that would indicate that e-bikes are connecting people more often to transit. We found nationally that 18% of pedal bike riders connect with transit on a weekly basis in our systems, compared to 24% of e-bike riders. So we're seeing that e-bikes are making it easier to ride shared micromobility, but also potentially making that connection to transit more powerful as well. Right now, the challenge for shared micromobility, of course, is keeping the batteries charged when we introduce scooters or e-bikes. They're wildly popular, but for us, as an example, we have people that are traveling around in any given day in our cities, swapping batteries, and that adds VMT to the overall picture, even though we're contributing this really sustainable mode of transportation. And that's not because we don't have a charging station solution. It's just that there's not a coordinated approach or a widespread use of charging infrastructure on the ground in cities across the US. And so, as Harriet said, this is a huge opportunity. Congress and USDOT are obviously thinking a lot about how to do this for electric vehicles. And I think for pennies on the dollar, we have the opportunity to bring shared micromobility along for that ride. For context, our team has been doing a lot of modeling to think about how we could address some of our operational challenges and reduce VMT through a charging station network. And you don't have to bring power to all of the stations in a network to see the benefits. So for context, we estimate that we can bring power to 20% of stations in our networks, and we would offset 70 to 90% of battery swaps by doing that. And the reason is if you place the charging stations in the most dense locations where a lot of the bikes are traveling through, on any given day, bikes will pass through that station, right? So you can create an economy of scale. This also has the benefit of making e-bikes more available to riders over time. So a huge opportunity there. We're really bootstrapping it right now. I wanted to use Chicago as an example. We have a great partnership with the Chicago Department of Transportation, where we are piloting 5 charging stations as part of our Divvy bike share network. We're working closely with the utility provider, but in those charging station locations, we've set up a meter for each individual station that's net new for the city. We haven't been able to really insert ourselves into a co-location strategy because I think that is nascent as is. So I'm really excited about the work that this coalition is doing under NUMO, People for Bikes, and NAPS's leadership, because I think this is a massive public works project, right? And when we think about the public right-of-way and leveraging it for greater use cases, we don't want to dig 5 times, right? We want to dig once and make sure that we're creating a grid connection for multiple points of use that will drive our sustainability goals. Harriet went through a lot of the funding opportunities that are out there, and I know we'll dig into that during the Q&A, so I won't repeat, but I wanted to clarify that, like, when we talk about making use of those funds as an operator to enable a charging station network, we don't mean that we need those funds to pay for our charging stations. It's actually the trenching and the grid connection that is the greatest opportunity, and it is a one-time spend that can create this overall incredible benefit for multiple types of providers. And then the final thing I wanted to just say from an operator perspective, and given the sort of context of this conversation today, is that with the Bicycle Commuter Act under Congressman Blumenauer's leadership, of course, we have an incredible opportunity to make sort of trying out micromobility much easier for Americans, bringing this tax benefit, pre-tax benefit back, and reinstating it with the opportunity for those pre-tax dollars to be spent instead of on car parking, on shared micromobility, will encourage people to think about making multimodal trips on any given day. And this is something that's super exciting to us as an operator, and we're really thrilled to be a part of a community like this one, where we are sort of creating a new path ahead for people to try a more sustainable mode of transportation. Thank you very much, and I'll pass it back to the next panelist.
Thanks, Caroline, so much for your comments, and just want to highlight, you kind of underscored the theme that Harriet had started this off with, of the resiliency that shared micromobility can add to a transit network. And importantly, really want to highlight this opportunity that you're mentioning here about, this dig once, that now is an important opportunity that we can utilize to build out a charging network, not only for cars, but also for shared micromobility and increase access to bikes and bike share and shared microability for people to get to those jobs and get to all those important places. So with that, I'm going to transition us now and like to introduce Dr. Jennifer Dill, Professor and Director of the Transportation Research and Education Center at Portland State University. So over to you.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you for providing me the opportunity to be here. So what I will share today draws upon research that I and my Portland State colleagues have done, including, I must recognize, John MacArthur, as well as research from our University Transportation Center, NITSE, the National Institute for Transportation and Communities. So electric powered micromobility, both shared and personal, as Harriet has noted, can play an important role in people's everyday travel needs. So our survey of e-bike owners in North America found that 34% used their e-bike for commuting and 29% used it for errands. And nearly half of the e-bike commutes would have been made in a private car otherwise without that e-bike. Some of the top motivations for getting an e-bike were to overcome typical barriers to bicycling, such as hills and long trip distances, revealing that e-bikes really do expand the potential for cycling as a transportation mode. Data from Portland shows that about 40% of e-scooter users say they are driving and using taxi and ride hailing less. And over time, users appear to be riding e-scooters more for utilitarian purposes and to access transit. A recent review of research found that 25 to 40% of e-scooter trips were replacing car trips. And in some cities, there is evidence that e-scooters facilitate access to transit. There are, however, some valid concerns that to date, at least, micromobility may not be expanding accessibility equitably. Most research on bike share finds that users are more likely to be male, white, higher income, and younger. And most e-scooter research has some similar findings, though there's some limited evidence that e-scooters might be serving lower income people better than bike share. And then amongst e-bike owners, we found a gender gap similar to that we see for bicycling overall in the US. But we are seeing a lot of evidence of opportunities to address some of those user patterns. Many of the e-bike owners that we surveyed got their e-bike because medical conditions limited their ability to ride a conventional bike. And this means that e-bikes could really increase cycling amongst older people in addition to people with physical limitations of any age. They may also help close that bicycling gender gap. The ability to carry cargo and kids on an e-bike was particularly attractive for women that we surveyed. And the female bike owners feel significantly more safe riding an e-bike compared to a standard bicycle. All of these findings indicate that micromobility has great potential to address pressing policy concerns, including the climate crisis and improving accessibility and mobility for underserved populations. But policy and investment are definitely needed to help increase the use of these modes for everyday travel. Key is the provision of infrastructure where users feel safe and comfortable. And such infrastructure can also improve safety, reducing conflicts with other vehicles and pedestrians. Our research on bike share in underserved neighborhoods found that concerns over traffic safety are the biggest barrier to riding. And some NHTSA research from University of Arizona found that the presence of bike lanes was correlated with lower rates of e-scooter users on sidewalks. And those who preferred to ride the e-scooter in bike lanes were less likely to have experienced a crash. The researchers also found that simply prohibiting sidewalk riding is not effective, particularly on roadways with high motor vehicle traffic and speeds, pointing to the need for higher quality separated infrastructure, not just a white stripe and a skinny 5-foot bike lane. Providing networks of physically separated lanes in addition to slow shared streets is key to increasing mode share significantly. We also need some research to understand how to better design such networks for the range of powered micromobility vehicles of today and tomorrow. Parking infrastructure is also important. Our research in Portland found that compliance with e-scooter parking rules was much higher on blocks with designated parking areas, which may not be a surprise. Providing space for these vehicles and perhaps complementary charging infrastructure can solve many of the complaints related to sidewalk accessibility. Making micromobility financially more accessible to all is also needed. Amongst the lower income and people of color we surveyed, the top 3 changes that would increase bike share use were discounted bike share memberships, free transfers between public transit and bike share, and more shorter term membership options, which would be more affordable. Including micromobility in universal basic mobility programs may also be an effective option. These programs provide financial resources to lower income people to use on transportation services. Our evaluation of a small pilot program amongst affordable housing residents in Portland revealed interest in using the resources for bike share and e-scooter share, particularly in neighborhoods where regular transit service was less frequent. So the modes can definitely be complementary. Purchase incentives can also be very effective. While e-bikes are much less expensive than a car, and some of the, as Harriet noted earlier, prices still do range between $1,000 and maybe $5,500 and can be higher for cargo style e-bikes, which are quite popular, particularly for families. Our research on e-bike incentives found that in some cases, an incentive for e-bikes could actually perform better than one for electric cars in terms of cost efficiency, number of incentives provided, and total CO2 emissions saved. And as Harriet noted, we're currently tracking dozens of such programs in the US and have developed some guidance on how to design and implement such incentives, including some of those equity provisions that she noted. Removing non-financial barriers is also important and something that policy can address. In addition to cost, our bike share research found that lack of knowledge also plays an important role. And we found that more personal, interactive marketing and education seems to help overcome these barriers. A recent NHTSA study led by University of Oregon found that 62% of micromobility programs have at least one equity requirement. And the most common ones were an alternative to requiring smartphones for use, cash payment options, and reduced payment options. And those address some of the key barriers. About 1/3 of the programs had at least one of those policies. And 30% had some sort of geographic distribution requirement, which is obviously fundamental to improving access. However, research is still needed on how effective these requirements are. Greater integration between transit and shared micromobility at all levels could also address some of the barriers ranging from fare payment integration to the stability of shared mobility services. Another set of barriers, particularly for shared micromobility, exist for people with disabilities and youth. Very few systems have requirements for adaptive vehicles, and most prohibit people under 18 or 16 from using the vehicles. Policy and funding could help overcome some of these barriers. I also must note that I have focused on micromobility for personal travel. There's also great potential for powered micromobility to deliver freight, particularly in urban areas. And with all of these micromobility modes, whether for people or freight, there's also a need looking forward to ensure that these vehicles are detected by and integrated with connected and autonomous vehicle technologies to ensure and improve safety. I want to thank the Congressman, People for Bikes, NABSA, and Pneumo Alliance for this opportunity, and I will put some of the links to the research that I mentioned in the chat. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, I didn't want to put you on the spot, but I actually was considering on the spot sort of asking for some of those links because especially in the beginning there, you started with a lot of numbers that were really powerful that I think many of us will want to go back to and look at that. So just, overall general comment that you and your department has done so much really great and impactful research. So thank you for sharing that with us today. And a few that stood out, for example, from the earlier part of your comments was, for example, half e-bike commutes you found in your study would have been made by cars, and about 40% of e-scooter riders are saying that they would have made some trips by car if they were not making them on scooters. Also, really want to just highlight and underscore what your comments about policy investment being needed to increase these modes of travel, as well as bringing up safe street infrastructure, which is really an important component here. And then, of course, thank you for bringing in equity to the conversation as well with all of that wonderful research. So with that, I don't yet see that the congressman has been able to join us, so I'd like to move us into Q&A at this time. And so also want to pause here and say for those attending, please put your questions in that Q&A box and we will try to get to your question. So first question is, so actually, I think several folks can answer this question. Perhaps we can, I think, start with Caroline, but the question is, and maybe actually Jennifer too, do rebate ownership programs replace more car trips than shared micromobility programs? So I guess the question is, and of course, you know, this policy briefing is about both shared and personally owned micromobility. So the question is, if any folks have some research or examples around, you know, how the replacement of personally owned and shared, I think, is really the point of this question here. And if there's sort of a difference in mode shift for those different use cases.
I don't think it's a great question. I don't think we know that. I haven't seen any research that sort of looks at that difference between owned versus shared. And it really, and especially on the e-scooter side, because personally, I think that's an area where I think people, there's potential for people purchasing e-scooters in the future, more so than now. So
I don't think this is a specific answer to the question, but some of the there's a development company in particular in Washington who did some analysis of parking utilization of their multifamily buildings. And they looked at factors, including proximity to transit. They looked at income of the residents, and they looked at walk score, which is a measurement of proximity to stuff that you might, you know, be able to get to easily, and found that it was that proximity. So denser, more mixed use places just made it inconvenient to own a car. And so I think Robin Chase had some discussion in the chat that also suggested that the proliferation of choices combined with a land use pattern that gives you destinations that are nearby and convenient, so that so cities planning for short trips, however you make them, that the trips can be pretty short, that combination makes a very compelling case to you know, have one less car in your household. And for some households, that means not any cars. So I think that's the state that we're, I think, hoping to achieve. And micromobility, shared and owned, is just another, you know, very convenient modality to kind of add to the mix to make it possible for people to not have that big expense of car ownership.
Thanks for that, Harriet.
I'll maybe add, as you're coming up with the next question, I think they probably really are complementary, because I think the shared services work really well for people who want to be very multimodal, use transit one way, then hop on an e-scooter, maybe take a shared bike somewhere else. And the purchase incentives are, you know, they're a bigger commitment. And you're probably going to use that single mode more often instead of mixing things up.
Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, that's actually exactly what I was going to say as well in follow-up, is that, you know, in my experience, it's really complementary. It's not kind of either or, but really this is an ecosystem approach here. And so, you know, in my own, you know, just anecdote from my own personal life, you know, I can alternate between, you know, transit, a personally owned bike, shared bike or scooter, and so forth. So I think it all really works together.
And actually,
oh yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, before bike share was introduced for the first time in the US, some of us probably remember there was a lot of concern about the impact on bike shops or the bike industry. And I think that's another just data point to show, as we've seen incredible growth in shared micromobility ridership, we've also seen obviously a bike boom more broadly. And so I think it's a rising tide lifts all boats kind of a phenomenon.
Carolyn, we used maybe less savory reference. We called it the gateway drug to cycling.
There you go. I like it.
When you basically were dock blocked a couple times of trying to use a bike share and couldn't park it or couldn't, or the kiosk was empty. You're like, I'll show them. I'm going to get my own bike. So yes, totally effective.
Great. Well, I'm glad that was a robust conversation around that. Oh, and I see that the Congressman actually is now able to join us. So we're just going to pause on the Q&A. Congressman Blumenauer, hello. Thank you for joining us. I just want to make sure that you're fully connected and you can hear us.
Hi, everyone. This is actually Zoe from Congressman Blumenauer's office. The Congressman is walking back from votes right now, and he'll turn his video on when he's joining in a few minutes. Okay, great. So glad I did the check. All right, so we'll actually move back into Q&A. Thank you so much. So we'll move back into Q&A. All right. So actually, and thank you everybody. They're really rolling in at this point. So really appreciate all the questions. There are a few questions in here about charging. And so I want to make just kind of pose, and Carolyn, we can start with you because you had made some of these points in your comments already, and maybe we can kind of underscore and elaborate on, what can we do to increase shared micromobility charging, the capability for shared micromobility charging, especially in this important moment as we're all looking at enhancing the grid for charging EVs more broadly. What can we do?
Yeah, I mean, I think I touched on it, and I'm sure other panelists have ideas, but I think the bringing power to the curb, really thinking about setting up those grid points of connection as widely accessible to multiple use cases as possible is like the number one. And then I think it's like also thinking about the coordination effort at the local level that will make a public works project like that possible. I see something in here about like universal charging for micromobility. I don't know that that's really a thing. I actually don't think we need to choose. Like, we happen to have stations that we rely on as an operator for both rebalancing and potentially charging. So we wouldn't be able to turn those docking points over to, anyone just because practically they are actually how we operate the system. But again, that's not at the expense of other types of charging infrastructure. And actually, if you bring power to our large installed station base, you can create an opportunity for co-location at those locations, which is a great thing because we fought really hard for that space. As someone that, worked on bringing bike share to New York before I worked at Lyft, every station location was a community fight. And we had to take some car parking and we had to repurpose that space back to shared bikes. And so now we have these physical places through those station networks that we can really think of as, I think, opportunities. So that would be my quick thoughts, but I'm sure others may have some reactions as well.
I don't want to put anyone else on the spot, but Harriet and Jennifer, feel free to jump in if you do have any additional thoughts there.
I have a bizarre thought, a random thought about electrification, about how we're not so great at using the capacity in our grid. Like, it's a bit of a mystery for city officials in many cities. They don't have a map of where there's existing capacity. And when they ask the utility, it's a bit like whack-a-mole. They make an ask for a proposal location for charging. And then after several weeks, hear back, no, that's not so good. Or it's going to take 2 years to do an upgrade to make that viable when there are existing locations where there's capacity. But I also think as we renovate our house and add 14 kilowatts of solar power, I'm like, I can charge bikes, I can charge cars. Why don't I put my charging infrastructure in a location that's publicly accessible so that people can do that? So I think that there might be more opportunity if you could overcome the transaction cost issue to making some of that charging infrastructure available in the public right-of-way or adjacent to the public right-of-way, but pulled from the house, pulled from a building, from a residence. And I think that would overcome some of our problems with the grid and might make it much more likely that the power, you could demonstrate that it's solar provided for the most part. Just a thought.
Thanks, Harriet. Great. So we'll move on to another topic. Interestingly, we have several questions that are asking about inspiration and lessons learned from Europe, actually. So again, don't want to put anyone on the spot, but I thought perhaps Harriet, we could start with you, given that Numo does have a global reach in some ways here. Really just kind of looking at what Europe has done with micromobility and shared micromobility, and any lessons come to mind. And of course, other panelists, please feel free to jump in as well.
I mean, I love all the great examples from Europe. I love what the mayor of Paris has done. I love the very demonstrable and enormous increase in cycling that's resulted from putting restrictions on where cars can go and making it a public goal. Sometimes it's enough to say, we want to encourage this and we're going to do these things to help make this happen, because part of being a good citizen is to try to emit less carbon and to try to use the most efficient mode, for making your trip. It's not going to be for everybody, but let's just make the public statement that this would be good for all of us. This is a good societal thing. And I think sometimes in the US, we're afraid, to make those statements, right? You can make those statements without being pejorative about people who, for a variety of reasons, find it very difficult to make that choice. But it's easier now than it's ever been. And as I was saying at the top of this conversation, the infrastructure is really important. So they're not just saying it in Europe, they're actually providing the protected infrastructure. And to the extent, I think I answered one of the questions in the chat about this, that most of the money coming from the bipartisan infrastructure law is coming to the Department of Transportation, but a lot of the other money, it's possible to use for some of the same purposes. And there's really an encouragement from DOT to try to fix it first, work on existing streets rather than expansions of capacity. So why don't we make that, like the city of Cambridge, Mass did, the default, that if you're going to touch the street, that you're going to put in protected micromobility infrastructure. That's the default. You can not do that, but you have to explain why, as opposed to the other way around. So I think there are things that we could do that don't make us Europe, but might make it easier for some of these things to happen, including, having our public officials just be vocal about why it's good and why it's more equitable and why it's going to be a priority when it comes to what we consider safe and well-maintained infrastructure, having the protected facilities for all modes.
And I would add just quickly to that, because I think it's 100% the most important thing we can do is create streets that are inviting and safe for people that are choosing not to drive. But in Europe, it's also worth noting that for quite a while, actually, large amounts of public dollars flow into shared micromobility programs. And I think it's a simple statement, but a true statement that in really all aspects of our lives, a budget reflects your priorities. For the United States, right, the lion's share of our transportation funds flow to driving. So it's not surprising that we have a transportation network that is almost entirely focused on driving. And that's something we're kind of digging out of. If the takeaway of the next 5 years is that we're going to spend all of our money to make sure that cars are electric, not gas consuming, and we leave behind the kind of benefits of smaller, lighter weight vehicles to have a place on the road, it will have been in vain, because we will be missing a huge opportunity, right, to change the nature of how Americans can get around. And so I think we have a lot to look to Europe in terms of street design, but I think also in terms of how they prioritize transportation funding.
I'll just add, I agree completely with Caroline and Harriet on those points. And to add one more, inspiration from Europe is much better integration of transit and these modes. In Netherlands, the national rail system operates the bike share system, so integration is so much better. The trains there in many of Copenhagen, other cities, much easier to bring your bike on, or perhaps your e-scooter or e-bike, etc. And so just much better integration of transit with these other personal modes.
Great, thank you, everyone. And right on cue, Congressman Blumenauer is here, so I want to welcome you to the panel and thank you so much for being here, Congressman. So just as a brief introduction to then turn it over, as I know that you have some comments to share with the group. For those, I think most everyone knows who's on the call, but I know that we have some advocates joining us. And of course, Congressman Blumenauer is the founder and co-chair of the Congressional Bike Caucus. And Congressman, I want to thank you for your longstanding leadership in working towards bicycling supportive legislation. And in particular, want to highlight the recent inclusion of shared microability eligibility within the CMAQ program that was included in the bipartisan infrastructure law, which really would not have been possible without your continued work and leadership. So wanted to thank you, by of introduction, thank you for your work and leadership, and over to you.
Well, super. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to see old friends, Jennifer, Harriet. It's been a while. We need to plot and scheme. I think it's terrific. The administration has snagged our old buddy Gabe Klein, sort of managing some of this electrification. There are a number of refugees from livability activity in the past that have found their way into this administration. I'm excited about that. But dealing with micromobility is sort of a hidden story. I'm pleased with work that we've done in Portland over the years. For me, dealing with bike and pedestrian activity has been a very high priority in terms of what we do on the ground. I was honored that we opened the Blumenauer Bike Bridge a couple months ago, a project I've been working on for about 30 years in terms of connectivity. But that's the story of this, is being able to chip away, making modest, in some cases, very significant gains as we build the critical mass to give people a sense of how we can make the system work better with planning, more choices for people dealing with new transportation modes. I didn't start out as an e-bike fan or scooters, but I've been impressed with how they have taken hold. Now, those are challenges for those of you on the ground in local government. People, I'm deeply concerned about safety issues. Scooters, I see things every day that gives me heartburn, but it is a tremendous opportunity to expand the reach. Anything we can do to make sure that people's default is not to crawl into a vehicle, especially a single occupant vehicle. Micromobility is a movement that is gaining momentum. People are being more sophisticated. We've got more work that we need to do with the private sector and local government partners, being able to know about how the data is utilized. In the final analysis, a lot of this is just about solid planning. Transportation planning, changing attitudes, being able to harness these investments. You know, we have hundreds of billions of dollars of surplus right-of-way that we've had too much asphalt and concrete, where we've overbuilt and underpriced, where we don't put a value on the curb. People have made massive investments in housing for their cars that has driven up the cost of housing around the country. It's made challenges in terms of being able to do things right. But I think there are opportunities with some of our federal policies that are in place now, resources that the federal government has, and what we're seeing on the ground. I am pleased with what's happened in my hometown. Now, we haven't been moving upwards of late with increasing the mode split, but it's still the highest bike mode split of any big city in the country. And we've got neighborhoods where there's over 10% of the people who use alternative transportation. Our bike share is entirely electrified in Portland. It's been a boost to ridership, working hard in terms of equity, making the facilities available throughout the community. These are things that are making a difference. The scooter is a way that we enable people for that impulse trip. And again, I want them to do it more safely, be respectful, but it's a huge opportunity. And e-bikes are making anybody into a bike commuter. I am pleased with some of the momentum that we've had with our legislation, including charging stations. This is a comprehensive effort that we need to undertake. But I am convinced that these are things that people want, that if we're able to work with the neighborhoods, we're able to work with a variety of interest groups, and frankly, with industry and local government, we can make a profound difference. We've just barely scratched the surface of this. The pandemic illustrated that there are alternative uses, for example, for right-of-way. In the cities I visit, communities have recaptured some sidewalks and streets for restaurants and public spaces, not unlike what our friend Jeanette Sadiq Khan did with some of the redesign in New York back in the day. I mean, these are things we worked on in Portland, but it's Portland and nobody really pays that much attention. If you do it in New York or you do it in Washington, D.C., it has more impact. But now we're watching people across the country who are taking advantage of these. We've got some work to do in the aftermath of the pandemic. When you had the CDC arguing that you shouldn't take transit because of the public health risks, a little creepy. And it's going to take some time to do a reset here. But we're doing that. People are coming back. It is imperative that we are able to make these lessons more widely understood. Part of it will be a renaissance, I think, in terms of land use and transportation planning. We need to embed these principles in transportation and planning departments across the country. One of the things, I'm going to take a break and spend a day with the large firm architects, the 60 largest architectural firms in the country. We need to engage them as allies, landscape architects, traffic engineers are our friends. And we're seeing examples where traffic engineering is undergoing a renaissance. But we've got a whole generation of traffic engineers to educate. We've got work to do with city council, in particular, people to understand the power of getting these programs right. We shouldn't fight against the technologies. We should harness them to solve problems rather than create new ones. And I'm just excited about what I'm seeing around the country, where things that were a little, shall we say, esoteric or out there or a little too Portland are taking hold. People who have been involved, Harriet, with some of your proselytizing. It's mainstream. You're mainstream now. You're no longer out there. I find that really, really exciting. So we look forward to being your best friend in Congress. We look forward to a new Congress. And I don't know, I can't read the tea leaves. Obviously, I'm working hard for my team to be in charge. I think that's better for the country, and it's much better for what we want to do in terms of transportation, land use, and livability. But the fact is that the work that we've been doing, the work that you're dedicated to, does not have to be partisan. We talk about bike partisanship, being able to have people understand the impact of getting our policies right. And so many of them are not ideological, using some of the tools that inject hard-nosed economics. I mean, I'm serious about working together to price the curb. That's the only thing that really works. the notion that we're going to have larger populations where anybody can park their single occupant vehicle in front of their home or in front of their business or whatever their destination is, just simply doesn't work. We also have seen examples where the lessons are internalized. You know, when I was transportation commissioner, that parking space in front of the brew pub or the bookstore was gold. And I lived long enough to watch in Portland where we had tens of thousands of businesses that voluntarily gave up that parking space for a car and traded it for 10 or 12 spaces for bicycles. And it also kind of sunk into people that folks who are touring on bikes are actually better customers. They're more likely to sit down and linger over that beer or that coffee or to poke into a shop that looks interesting. And it changes the dynamic radically. The streets that we've calmed, we've demonstrated that property values go up as safety is enhanced and the quality of life is fundamentally different. It's not that we've won all those arguments. There'll still be battles over somebody's coveted parking space. And sadly, there's still some people who think that roads are safer by being wider and straighter. We know that that's not the case. We've got the evidence, everything from street trees to selective use of parking and protected bike lanes make people safe. We've got the facts, we've got examples, but we still have a sales job to do because of how deeply embedded the car culture is. But thank you for your efforts. Thank you for allowing me to share some of my biases with you. I look forward to working with you on the implementation of this legislation and moving forward in the next Congress to bring people together to solve problems in a rational, thoughtful way.
Thank you so much, Congressman, and the invitation to continue to work with you and colleagues to make this happen, and want to just underscore, the call that this is, this is an opportunity where there are federal resources to, make microability more embedded within the transportation network and ecosystem that we have in this country. So we are at the end of our call, so I'm just going to quickly rattle off some highlights here from the session, and then on the screen you can see where you can follow up with myself and Leanne and Noah from NUMO and People for Bikes, respectively. We talked about embedding a multimodal mindset into planning. The Congressman mentioned that this really isn't a partisan issue. We've talked about transit integration and resiliency and how microability and shared microability can really support transit and help that. The particular popularity of e-bikes, the importance of safe street infrastructure, and really the need to incorporate microability charging into this conversation about charging networks that we're having right now and EV charging into the conversation and the work that we're doing. So thank you, everyone. Big thanks to our panelists today, Harriet, Caroline, Jennifer, and Congressman Blumenauer. Thank you so much for your time. And also big thanks for everyone attending today to take the hour out of your time to learn more about this. So again, you can find us at the contacts that you see on your screen. And thank you so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thank you.